Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. So one of those fields of human activity and endeavour about which one here is very little in general is that of taxonomizing. For those who work with data-driven computer applications, it's a bit less abstract of a topic than it might otherwise seem. We're talking about designing the actual data schemas in an SQL database where you ideally, often this happens much more informally, but sit down with almost like a canvas for data, and you look at what tables you want to have, what foreign key constraints, the many to many, the many to one, all the relationships that actually define how the data system interacts. But before that, you got to think, well, what am I going to call this thing? So we kind of take for granted that we have these kind of standard divisions around which we organize information, like the kind of common bands we use in demographic analysis when we're looking at cohorts of the population are fairly standard across countries. But that is the work of taxonomy, and it's often something that happens when we think about how to organize. If you take the My Word Prompts project as an example, I've sat down a few times working with an AI agent to think, what is the taxonomy I want? Because you know that a big part of this project, and part of the reason that I'm these days trying to send in a lot of prompts, is that we're building up this tapestry of information that we're depicting on our topic universe graph node. And I think part of the potential value of this experiment in AI generated knowledge and the podcast is that the more we can put down data points, it becomes more interesting, the graph becomes richer, and finding things like trends and connections between disparate topics becomes a more potentially rewarding and intriguing process if you have a lot of data points. So when I was looking at that, my decisions were initially, well, if I want just someone who is interested in, let's say, parenting to find those episodes in the podcast, do I want a classic category tag taxonomy, or do we want to have subcategories? And these are all pretty, what might seem like very small decisions, but often make a big difference in the user experience. And if we're talking about digital taxonomy, I think that this is actually what differentiates between WordPress, which we talked about before, which has out of the box a pretty rigid category tag post page setup, and more enterprise grade systems for managing content, which often don't even define anything out of the box. You define the taxonomy, what you want to call this, what you want to call, do you want to have something else? What's this object going to be called? Contentful is a good example of something that takes this approach. So Herman and Corin, there are, I gather, some folks who don't just do this casually or in the context of their working with data, but actually dedicate their careers and their lives to the study of taxonomy, how us humans organize information. And that's what I'd love to talk about in this podcast. The history of taxonomy as a field, studying information architecture, information organization. And in a world where information has never been generated as quickly as it has currently, I think this is less of an academic topic than it might appear at first glance. Herman and Corin, over to you.
Have you ever noticed how much mental energy we spend just trying to put things in the right boxes? I was looking at my phone the other day, trying to decide if a certain app belonged in the productivity folder or the utility folder, and I realized I was having a minor existential crisis over a digital icon. It is a strange kind of friction, isn't it? That moment where your brain stalls because an object does not perfectly fit the mental map you have built for your life.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, that is the human condition in a nutshell. We are obsessed with order because the alternative is chaos, and the human brain is simply not wired to handle unmediated chaos. Today's prompt from Daniel is a deep dive into the history of taxonomy as a field, focusing specifically on information architecture and organization. It is such a foundational topic because it is not just about where we put things, it is about how we understand the world itself. When we categorize, we are not just tidying up, we are defining reality.
It is interesting that Daniel brought this up, because we usually think of taxonomy in the context of biology. You know, the whole kingdom, phylum, class, order thing we learned in school. I remember memorizing King Philip came over for good soup, just to keep the hierarchy straight. But Daniel is pointing us toward the digital realm, SQL databases, content management systems, and how we structure the massive amounts of data we are generating every second. It feels like we have moved from classifying beetles to classifying every single click and heartbeat.
Exactly. Taxonomy is essentially the practice and science of classification. The word itself comes from the Greek taxis, meaning arrangement, and nomia, meaning method. And while Carl Linnaeus is the big name everyone remembers from the 1700s for biological classification, the roots go back much further. Aristotle was trying to categorize the world over 2,000 years ago. He was looking at physical characteristics to group animals, but he was also trying to categorize logic and poetry. He believed that by naming the parts of a thing, you could understand its essence.
But Aristotle's system was pretty limited, right? I mean, he grouped things based on whether they had red blood or not, or if they lived on land or in the water. It was very binary.
It was, but it set the stage for the next 2 millennia. Before Aristotle, you had people like Callimachus at the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He created the Pinakes, which was essentially the first library catalog. He did not just list the books, he categorized them by genre like rhetoric, law, epic, and tragedy. He even included a brief biographical sketch of the authors. This was the birth of metadata. He realized that a pile of scrolls is useless if you cannot find the specific thought you are looking for.
So we've been fighting this battle against the pile of scrolls for a long time, but then we hit the Enlightenment and things got much more rigorous. That is where Linnaeus comes in, right?
Yes, Carl Linnaeus and his Systema Naturae in 1735. He introduced binomial nomenclature, the two-part naming system we still use today like Homo sapiens. But more importantly, he created a nested hierarchy. He realized that nature is not just a flat list, it is a series of containers within containers. This was a massive leap in information architecture. It allowed scientists across the globe to speak the same language. If you found a flower in Sweden and I found one in France, we could use his taxonomy to determine if they were the same species. It was the first global standard for data.
It sounds like he was the original database administrator. But as we moved into the 19th and 20th centuries, the sheer volume of human knowledge started to explode. We moved from classifying the natural world to classifying the world of ideas.
That is where the library sciences really took off. You cannot talk about taxonomy without mentioning Melvil Dewey. In 1876, he created the Dewey Decimal System. Before Dewey, libraries often organized books by the date they were acquired or even by the color of their spine. It was a nightmare for researchers. Dewey's genius was using a decimal system to represent subjects. Every subject got a number between 0 and 999. It was a universal language for the organization of human thought.
I remember the smell of those old card catalogues. But Dewey's system had some serious flaws, didn't it? It was very rigid. If a book was about both history and sociology, the librarian had to make a choice. It could only live in one physical spot on the shelf.
That is the physicality trap of traditional taxonomy. In the physical world, an object can usually only be in one place at one time. This led to the work of S.R. Ranganathan in the 1930s. He was an Indian mathematician and librarian who realized that the world was becoming too complex for simple hierarchies. He developed what we call faceted classification. Instead of one big tree, he thought of information as having different faces or facets. A book could have a subject facet, a language facet, a time facet, and an author facet.
That sounds much more like how we think today. It is like the difference between a folder on your desktop and a tag on a photo.
Precisely. Ranganathan's 5 laws of library science are still taught today. His work laid the conceptual groundwork for what we now call faceted search on e-commerce sites. When you go to buy a pair of shoes and you filter by size, color, brand, and price, you are using Ranganathan's faceted taxonomy. You are not looking through one box, you are looking at the intersection of multiple attributes.
I want to dig into that transition from the physical to the digital. When we moved from categorizing birds and plants to categorizing bits and bytes, what changed in the philosophy of organization? Because it feels like the digital world should have solved all these problems, but in some ways, it has made them more complex.
The digital shift changed the cost of categorization. In a library, adding a new category meant moving physical shelves. In a database, it is just a new line of code. This led to the rise of the relational database model in the 1970s, pioneered by Edgar F. Codd at IBM. He realized that data should be stored in tables that relate to one another through keys. This is the foundation of SQL, or Structured Query Language.
Daniel mentioned SQL specifically. When we talk about designing a data schema, we are talking about creating a very formal, very rigid taxonomy before any data even enters the system. You have to decide what the tables are, what the columns are, and how they relate. It feels like we went back to the rigidity of Linnaeus in some ways.
In a way, yes. SQL requires schema on write, meaning you have to know the structure before you save the data. This is great for integrity. If you are a bank, you want a very rigid taxonomy for your transactions. You want to ensure that a withdrawal cannot be confused with a deposit. You use things like the third normal form to eliminate redundancy. It is a beautiful mathematical way of organizing the world. But it struggles with unstructured data, like a long email or a video file.
And that is where content management systems, or CMS, come in, right? Most people interact with taxonomies through things like WordPress or Shopify.
Exactly. WordPress, which powers a huge chunk of the internet, has a very specific taxonomy built in. You have categories, which are hierarchical, and tags, which are flat. It is a hybrid system. But as Daniel pointed out, we are seeing a shift toward headless CMS platforms like Contentful or Strappy. In a traditional CMS, the taxonomy is tied to how the page looks. In a headless system, the taxonomy is pure data. You define content types. You might say, I want a content type called podcast episodes, and it must have a title, an MP3 link, a transcript, and a list of guests.
It is like building a custom skeleton for your information. But I see a problem here. The more flexible you make the system, the harder it is to maintain consistency across a large organization. If I call a guest a speaker, and you call them an interviewee, the system starts to break down.
That is the eternal struggle between controlled vocabularies and folksonomies. A controlled vocabulary is a predefined list of terms. It is top-down. It ensures precision. A folksonomy, a term coined by Thomas van der Waal in 2004, is user-generated tagging. Think of hashtags on social media. It is bottom-up. It is great for discovery and seeing how people actually talk, but it is terrible for data integrity. If you search for cinema, but I tag my video as movies, you might never find it.
It feels like we are constantly oscillating between these two poles. We want the freedom of tags, but we need the order of categories. Daniel also mentioned something called the Topic Universe Graph Node. That sounds like we are moving away from tables and towards something more organic.
We are. We are moving into the era of graph databases, like Neo4j. In a traditional SQL database, relationships are often an afterthought, something you join together when you need an answer. In a graph database, the relationship is a first-class citizen. You have nodes, which are the things, and edges, which are the connections. This is how Google's knowledge graph works. When you search for an actor, Google doesn't just show you a list of movies, it shows you their spouse, their awards, and their birth date. It understands the web of relationships.
It feels like we are trying to mimic the way the human brain actually works. We do not store memories in a spreadsheet. We store them through associations. One smell reminds you of a childhood summer, which reminds you of a specific person, which reminds you of a song. It is all interconnected.
That is the goal of the semantic web, an idea championed by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. He envisioned a web where machines could understand the meaning of data, not just display it. We use things like RDF, the Resource Description Framework, to create triples. A triple is a simple statement, subject, predicate, object. For example, corn is a host of my weird props. If you have enough of these triples, the machine can start to make its own inferences. It can reason about the data.
But here is the scary part, Herman. As we move into February of 26, we are seeing AI take over a lot of this work. We have large language models that can read 1 million documents and understand them without a human ever defining a category. Do we even need taxonomists anymore?
We need them more than ever, but their role is changing. We are moving from manual tagging to ontology engineering. An AI can group things, but it doesn't always know why it is grouping them. It might find a correlation between two things that is totally irrelevant or even harmful. We are also seeing the rise of vector databases like Pinecone or Milvil. These are fascinating. Instead of putting things in boxes, they turn every piece of information into a long string of numbers called a vector.
Wait, how does a number represent a category?
Think of it as a coordinate in a multidimensional space. If you have a 1,000-dimensional space, dog and puppy will have coordinates that are very close to each other. Dog and toaster will be very far apart. When you ask an AI a question, it doesn't look for a keyword, it looks for the nearest neighbor in that mathematical space. This is called semantic search. It is incredibly powerful, but it is also a black box. We cannot easily see why the AI thinks two things are related.
That brings up the issue of bias that Daniel mentioned. When you create a taxonomy, you are making a value judgment. You are saying these categories matter and these others do not. If an AI is creating its own taxonomy based on historical data, it is going to bake in all the prejudices of the past.
Absolutely. There is a landmark book by Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Leigh Starr called Sorting Things Out: Classification and Its Consequences. They argue that classifications are part of the built information environment. They are often invisible, but they have massive power. Think about medical taxonomies. For decades, many diseases were categorized based on how they appeared in men. Women's symptoms were often dismissed or categorized as atypical because they did not fit the established taxonomy. That is a life or death consequence of information architecture.
Or even something like ethnicity categories on a census. Those boxes change every 10 years because our social understanding of identity changes. But the data we collected 50 years ago is stuck in the old boxes. It makes longitudinal study really difficult.
It is the legacy data problem. Once you commit to a taxonomy, you are often stuck with it for a long time. This is why Daniel's interest in content management systems is so relevant. If you build a rigid system today, you are handicapping your future self. Modern information architects are moving toward composable systems. They want to be able to swap out parts of the taxonomy as the world changes.
So, how should the average person approach this? Most of us are just drowning in files, emails, and photos. We try to use folders, but then we forget which folder we put things in. We try to use search, but we cannot remember the keywords. Is there a better way to be our own information architects?
I think the biggest takeaway from the history of taxonomy is to move away from the one thing, one place mentality. Stop trying to find the perfect folder. Instead, focus on metadata. If you are saving a document, don't just name it invoice. Name it 2026-02-24 Invoice Acme Corp Marketing. You are essentially creating a flat taxonomy that is highly searchable.
It is like what we talked about in episode 712 regarding the second brain concept. It is about building a system that evolves with you. Use tags for states of a project, like to do or archived, and use categories for broad domains, like work or personal. But don't get too hung up on the perfect structure. The best taxonomy is the one you actually use.
And remember that your taxonomy is a living thing. In the world of software development, we talk about refactoring code. You should refactor your information architecture every few months. If you find yourself always looking for things in a certain way, change your system to match your behavior. Don't try to force your behavior to match a rigid system you created 3 years ago.
I love that idea of a living taxonomy. It makes me think about the work Daniel is doing with the topic universe graph. He is trying to map the relationships between ideas in a way that allows for new connections to emerge. It is not just about storing information, it is about generating new insights.
That is the ultimate goal of taxonomy. It is not just a filing cabinet, it is a lens. When you organize information correctly, you start to see patterns you never noticed before. You see how a concept in biology relates to a concept in economics. You see how a historical event in the 1700s is influencing a technological trend in 26. Taxonomy is the architecture of discovery.
It is the difference between a pile of bricks and a cathedral, as you said earlier. Both are made of the same material, but one has a structure that allows it to reach for the sky. I think about this in the context of our own show. We have over 800 episodes now. If someone wants to find every time we have talked about the future of work, they are relying on our internal taxonomy. We are the architects of this weird little universe.
And it is a responsibility we take seriously. We want people to be able to navigate this tapestry of ideas. That is why we are always looking at how we can improve the way we organize our own data. We are currently looking into implementing a vector-based search for our archives, so you can search for concepts rather than just keywords.
That would be incredible. Imagine being able to ask, what have Korn and Herman said about the emotional impact of technology, and getting a curated list of segments from across 5 years of shows. That is the power of modern information architecture.
It really is. And it brings us back to the human element. No matter how advanced the AI gets, we still need humans to decide what is meaningful. An AI can find 1,000 connections, but a human has to decide which ones are worth exploring. Taxonomy is an act of curation. It is an act of saying, this matters.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap up. Taxonomy is not just a technical field, it is a deeply human one. It is how we make sense of our lives and our history. It is how we build the cathedrals of knowledge that future generations will walk through.
Well said, Korn. And thank you to Daniel for such a rich prompt. It is easy to take the boxes in our lives for granted, but when you look closely, you realize they are some of the most important things we have ever built.
If you have been enjoying these deep dives into the weird and wonderful prompts Daniel sends us, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Whether it is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen, those ratings and reviews really help other curious minds find the show. It is how we grow our own little community of information seekers.
They really do. And if you have a prompt of your own, something that makes you look at the world a little differently, send it our way. We love exploring these hidden architectures of reality.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com, where we have the full archive and a contact form if you want to get in touch. You can also reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We love hearing from you. Whether you are a professional taxonomist or just someone trying to organize their phone apps.
Thanks for joining us for another exploration. This has been My Weird Prompts.
We will see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.